Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Rabbi Eli Confer. I'm so excited to welcome you to this space that apparently we've outgrown, and welcome all of you who are here for the first time, and to those who are coming back. It's my honor and pleasure to welcome to the podium Mr. Jeremy Pava, who is a longtime supporter of the activities of Rav Yitz and a great friend to Hadar, and he's going to introduce the panel. So please.
Thank you. So welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening to celebrate the release of two incredible new books, The Triumph of Life by Rabbi Yitz Greenberg and Judaism. I'll wait for the applause. And Judaism is About Love by Rabbi Shai. Both books are sure to have a profound impact on Jewish life, community, and spirituality. Tonight we have a treat in store for us as we enjoy a special conversation featuring these two leading theologians of our generation, Rabbis Yitz Greenberg and Shai. I personally could not be more excited because I have known both of them for many years, and they are both my Jewish heroes. I can't tell you how many Divrei Torah I've delivered, which begin, Yitz Greenberg, or Shai points out, I'm just glad I don't have to pay them a royalty every time. It would get very expensive. Both Yitz and Shai are both incredibly insightful, relevant, and inspirational. Rabbi Yitz Greenberg is a renowned thinker and leader, serving as president of the J.J. Greenberg Institute and senior scholar in residence at Hadar. A pioneer in Jewish communal leadership, Holocaust education, and pluralistic Jewish learning, Rav Yitz has dedicated his life to advancing Jewish thought and practice. Rabbi Shai Held, president and dean of Hadar, is a theologian, scholar, and educator, recognized as one of the most influential rabbis in America. He's the author of The Heart of Torah and Judaism is About Love, challenging us to deepen our commitments to love, justice, and community. Tonight's conversation will be moderated by Rabbi Tali Adler, a valued faculty member at Hadar, who brings her own insight and passion for Jewish texts and teachings. Her passion for teaching and community engagement makes her a trusted voice in today's Jewish learning landscape. We are deeply grateful to have these exceptional leaders with us this evening as we listen to their reflections on life, love, and what it means to live a Jewish life in today's world, especially during these very difficult times. May we find inspiration, wisdom, and the courage to live lives filled with purpose and connection. Please join me in warmly welcoming Rabbis Yitz Greenberg, Shai Held, and Tali Adler.
Thank you so much. I want to just add that something that's incredibly special about tonight's conversation is that Rav Shai has been a student and beloved colleague of Rav Yitz for many, many years. I want to just share one of my first memories of Torah from Rav Shai was hearing him stand at the front of the Beit Midrash in Hadar and say, as my teacher Rav Yitz Greenberg said. And I'm incredibly honored to be witness to this conversation. Let's start, if we can, by making sure that we have a chance to articulate some of the main ideas in each of your books. I'll start by asking Rav Yitz if you could spend a few minutes telling us what are the three eras, what's the triumph of life? And Rav Shai, if you would, what do you mean when you talk about love and why is it so central to Judaism?
Tali begins with the lighthearted, always.
on one foot. You know the story. They want me to teach Judaism on one foot, the book on one foot. The story in the Talmud says that this potential convert comes to Hillel and Shammai, and he says to him, would you teach me the Torah on one foot? And Hillel, of course, does do that, but he goes to Shammai first, and Shammai is very annoyed. I mean, how silly to teach the whole Torah on one foot. So the Gemara says he knocked him down. Of course, it was easy to do that. He was standing on one foot. But so my temptation is to say, knock me down before I commit this atrocity. But the 3 years on, there were some days I really sympathized with Shammai. I thought, it's a challenge. You want people to take the tradition seriously, and on the other hand, Hillel was right. So anyway, to come back to our story, the 3 years, in essence, what I've tried to make sense of is facts that we all know and share each other, and one of them being very simply, the Bible is full of miracles, splitting the Red Sea, and a host of other miracles that really, you know the story of the kid who comes home from Hebrew school and tells his mother, says, what did you study in school today? He says, Mother, well, you know, the Jews were escaping, leaving Egypt, and the Egyptian army chased them, and they got to the Red Sea. Moses quickly ordered the engineers to build pontoons, and then they wired it with electricity and with explosives, and then all the Jews crossed over, and as soon as the Egyptians got them, they blew it up, and they all drowned. She says, Johnny, is that what they taught you in school? He says, no, Mom, but if I told you in school, you wouldn't believe me. So we're all trying to come to grips, it seems to me, with some way. On the one hand, we don't see those kind of miracles. We don't hear voices from heaven. We don't have prophets who give us the direct word of God. And I've wrestled with that for a long time. And of course, it took me some time to grasp that was the whole point of the rabbinic tradition, to understand that God, as it were, has shifted. So the heart of the Jewish religion, I still maintain in the book, is God, the Creator, who has a vision of this beautiful creation being made even better, being turned into a paradise, a world of justice, a world full of life, a world full of without evil. That is the dream. But how do you get there? And that's the greatness of the Jewish tradition claim. God, as it were, voluntarily recruits humans, Homo sapiens, to join in a partnership and say, it's not going to happen from heaven, it's your responsibility. What the rabbis also taught me was that in the first stage, God is the senior partner and does the heavy lifting. But as they grow, and that's the whole point of covenant, respect for people. When they grow, when students grow, when children grow, you make room for them. The rabbi's idea was that God becomes more hidden. God shifts, as it were, presentation, self-presentation. And in this second stage, God is more hidden, but more present. That's the beauty of the rabbi's insight. So in the past, you could go out of the temple to see God. Now, in your kitchen, and when you cook a meal, you can have the presence of God, which you only had when you brought a sacrifice into the temple once a month or once a year or once a lifetime. The rabbis say, if you have a table and people sit there and speak words of Torah and they speak words of kindness, if you have hospitality, if you go to the hospital, the Shekhinah is right there at the head of the bed. In other words, there were tremendous expansion of the presence, only it wasn't visible anymore. You had to see it, you had to discover it. I kind of come to grips with the question that in our time, in our culture, it's almost impossible, or it's very difficult to see the hand and the presence. What's more seriously, there's no evidence, or at least no serious evidence, that people who get prayed over get cured at better rates than people who are treated in a normal medical way. In fact, to be honest about it, most people have shifted to medical specialists rather than a bracha of the Rabbi because they figure the odds out after a while. So I'm kind of trying to come to that, what's happening here? And my conclusion was, the truth is what started me on this whole path was the Holocaust. Because again, it seemed to me, by my understanding of covenant, God should have saved the Jewish people, should have stopped the Gentiles, should have stopped the Nazis, should have stopped the killing. Not that I could see it happen. And so again, I wrestle with that question because I really felt religiously and personally I do feel presence of God, but how do you account for this situation? So on one foot, my conclusion was that we're living in the third stage of the covenant. Because again, when people become more qualified, more capable, God makes room for them to take on more responsibility. So just as in the rabbi's time, God said, no more voices from heaven, no more prophecy, no more visible miracles. But humans have to step up and take responsibility. They have to figure out what God wants at this moment. We're living in an even more extraordinary moment, I think. And if I had to date it, I would date it back to modernity, to the beginning of the modern period. Because the great purpose and achievement, really, of modern civilization is this message. Human beings should not wait. They should not be passive. They should not be holding back. They should take charge. And if they take charge, they can do all the things that Judaism dreams of doing. Overcoming poverty and overcoming hunger. Jewish messianism, overcoming war, overcoming discrimination and inequality and oppression, overcoming sickness. Those are all part of the agenda of the Jewish tradition. And modernity said, take charge and do it. And you know what? There were amazing accomplishments. There were. Been life extension, a lot of diseases cured, a lot of poverty. 1 billion people went out of poverty in my lifetime. So it was a great, great move. And I believe it's a response of all of humanity to this divine message. I'm self-limiting, I want you to take more power. What's the catch? And that's what the rest of the book. The catch is that when people took power and when they didn't see visible evidence of God or obvious evidence, so they begin to believe that they're God, I'm the master of the universe. And so the industrialization that takes out of poverty gets out of control, and it starts to ruin creation, and it starts to cause global warming and species destruction and so on. In other words, power, if it is not guided by a moral ethic, or what I call the covenantal ethic, limit, responsibility, accountability of a partner, you're not the owner, and it becomes pathological. And my argument is that what we are living through, and this is the moment that we are born for, this is our generation, is that God is asking, in this case in the Jewish covenant, Jewish will take power after the Shoah. The reason God did not stop the Shoah happened hundreds of years before that, because the divine had already said, I'm self-limiting, and from now on I will work through human beings. There are more miracles now than ever before in our history, but God works only through human agents by choice, by human agents and by natural law. By natural law. In my lifetime, Crick and Watson decoded DNA and were able to cure genetics. But that meant they took medical power and they used human intelligence to find the power of genes that God has placed in genes. So my point simply is, what's the equivalent in Jewish life? And I think the equivalent is obvious. After the Holocaust, where we were powerless, and we're the people who did have power to stop the Nazis. That's the Allies. And the neighbors didn't use that power. That's why it was such a total catastrophe. The Jewish people woke up and started to take power. That's what's said of Israel. The Jewish people responded to death with an outburst of life. And I believe a renewal of the covenant in a special way. Except when God is totally hidden, that means the halakha, the way of life, expands to cover even more areas. It also means when you take power, it's very crucial how you use that power morally, and that's in the chapter in the book, and I'm willing to write further about it. I think Israel has, in fact, used its power morally, and even in this tragedy of the death of thousands in the Gaza war, I think they have made major effort to minimize those deaths in the pursuit of a just war. So anyway, the long and short of it is, it seems to me, and that's what the book is arguing, that this generation has a responsibility and the power to take charge and to make a major further breakthrough in the achievement of the goals of the tradition and of the vision of Messianism, and making this world a world of justice and peace, a world in which we do overcome sickness, in which we do overcome poverty. And basically what the book tries to suggest is how we can expand the holiness, that is to say, the depth of living and the work of Tikkun Olam, of perfecting the world, by our activity, guided by and in partnership with the divine.
So at the risk of sounding like a congregational rabbi, before I answer the question, I want to just say a couple of things. The first is, having spent several decades now as Rav Yitz's student, I want to say that from the Torah that I've learned from Rav Yitz is one thing, and the midot and the character traits that I learned from Rav Yitz are another thing, and in some ways a more powerful thing. When we decided to do this evening, I suggested to Yitz, I'm happy to interview you. I'm happy to just draw out some of what you have to say. And Rav Yitz, being Rav Yitz, said, we're not doing that. You've earned the right to be up here with me as a peer, which I would contest still, but the point is about Yitz. And I want to sort of acknowledge that, which leads me to say one other thing, which is I want to sort of acknowledge that something very rare and beautiful, I think, is visible on this stage. When I was in my 20s, I spent a lot of time cutting my teeth and growing my soul on Rav Yitz's Torah. When Tali Adler was in her 20s, she spent a lot of her years cutting her teeth and growing her soul in the Hadar Beit Midrash. This is 3 generations of a chain, and it feels like an incredible privilege to be here together. So, to answer Tali's question, I don't want to belabor this point because many of you have heard me go on and on about this, but I do think it's important to say that one of the challenges that I think the Jewish community faces, certainly in North America and probably elsewhere, is the legacy of centuries of Christian anti-Judaism that have been profoundly internalized by Jews from across the denominational spectrum. That is, Jews have been told for 2,000 years that whereas Christianity is about love, Judaism is about something else. Judaism is not about love. My dream is that one day people look at the title of my book and say, yeah, that's obvious, rather than, really? I would never have seen it that way. And that is really a legacy that we have to get out from under, and I will tell you, it is very hard work. I get this response from Reform rabbis, from conservative rabbis, from American kids learning in Hadar yeshivot in Israel, this sort of sense, they are totally convinced that whatever Judaism is about, it's not love, and no matter how much or how often you place the most basic Jewish sources in front of them, no, it's not about that. When I meet this resistance, one of the first things I often say is, let's just talk about liturgy. Ahavara ba'ahavtanu, with vast love have you loved us, ve'avtat Hashem Elohecha, and you should love the Lord your God. The liturgy is an enacting of a love story, a God who says, I love you and I invite you to love me back. That's not Christianity, right? That's basic Jewish liturgy. And the project that I would say that I've been engaged in for much of my adult life is to try and help Jews see Judaism again unencumbered by the gaze of the majority culture, unencumbered by the withering gaze of how Christians have tended to speak to Jews and about Jews. I will say as a footnote that one of the great brachas of my life has been spending much of the last 7 months actually talking to Christians about this and meeting, obviously in a self-selecting way, a fairly receptive audience to a lot of this challenge. But I do think this is very deep work that will take a long time for Jews to put down. We know, right? There's social science about this. We know that minority cultures come to view themselves often through the lens of the majority culture, and American Jews don't often think. Some American Jews have started to think again about this, but American Jews have not largely thought of themselves really as a minority, but religiously, we've been a minority for 2,000 years, and that has had massive repercussions. I'll add as a footnote that there was also a point in the American Jewish experience where American Jews who did not know a lot about Judaism, but who were anxious about assimilation, began themselves to define their Judaism as whatever they imagined Christianity was not. Which is why, for example, generations of Hebrew school students have been taught in this country that Judaism has no notion of the afterlife. Right? If you know anything about Jewish sources, forget about that being wrong. It's just sort of strange. How could you possibly think that? And I think what you had was basically American Jews who thought, well, Christianity, it's not like they were scholars of Christianity. Christianity, they care only about how to get into heaven. We don't even believe in heaven, right? And so you have a caricature of Judaism and of Christianity. And what ends up happening, and this is really just the sort of frame, is you have a kind of double whammy. You have a majority culture that tells the minority culture that it's not about love, and you have a minority culture that's anxious about distinguishing itself from the majority culture and ends up saying, lo and behold, we're not about love. But to be a religion that's not about love is actually to lose the heart of what the Torah is about. And the theological claim that sort of animates, I guess, everything that I've tried to write and talk about is the idea that we are all, each of us and all of us, created with love for love. Kadosh Baruch Hu loves us. That's a basic claim of rabbinic theology, I think. Chaviv Adam Shenivra B'Tselem, says Rabbi Akiva. Beloved is the human being simply by dint of being created in the image of God. And we are summoned by the Torah to live lives of love. To love God, to love the neighbor, to love the sojourner, ultimately in later Jewish sources, to love all humanity. And I'll just say one last thing about what do I mean by love? Because I think this is actually quite important not to misunderstand what Jewish sources mean when they say that love is commanded. I don't think the kind of love that is commanded is equivalent to a feeling or an emotion. It has emotional dimensions, which I'll underscore in 1 second, but it is more like an orientation, a posture, a stance I take towards the world. Or if you like the language of philosophy, I find this helpful, at least in my own head, it's a disposition to feel certain things and act in certain ways. Now, if you have a disposition to feel certain things and you never feel them, you will lose the disposition, right? It has to bubble up as feeling, but it itself is not a feeling. You can't command people to feel anything all the time. Try meditating for 45 seconds. And you'll see that emotions come and go, right? I was just feeling so grateful 1 minute ago, and now I hate everyone I know, right? Literally, just this sentence, right? And so love is something much deeper than an emotion. It's a way of orienting myself to the whole world, right? I can feel all kinds of things. I can feel grief, I can feel sadness, I can feel disappointment, and still be oriented around love. And that's what I think the mitzvah is. And it's also crucial to say, love is not one posture. It's a series of postures. You don't love your child the same way you love my child. I hope not. You don't love the stranger the same way you love God. Right? They are all versions of, expressions of, right, a desire for others to flourish. That's Ramban's understanding of what loving your neighbor means, right? Wanting others to flourish and have blessing. That's actually what I think unites all these different forms of love. Love is a kind of umbrella that holds a whole series of ways we are invited, summoned, and commanded by God to interact with the world with.
I just want to make sure that we take a moment, Rav Shai, when you said that I cut my teeth in on the Hadar Beit Midrash on Hadar's Torah, that was Rav Shai's Torah. I just want to make sure that we acknowledge that. I think to take the liberty of paraphrasing a little bit, we have two claims on the table tonight. Judaism is about love, and Judaism is about life. To the editor sitting in this room, who I'm sure spent a lot of time coming up with the title, forgive me. I apologize right now. I would love to hear a little bit if each of you could engage with the other's claim. Rav Shai is Judaism about life. Rav Yitz is Judaism about love. And specifically, I'd love to hear a little bit about what you each struggle with in each other's work. What questions do you have?
So, my personal answer is that, in fact, I'll give you first the getaway evasive answer. The answer is, the Talmud asks, what is the great principle of the Torah? Rabbi Akiva says it's love your neighbor as yourself. That principle runs through the whole Torah. Ben Azai says, no, the great principle is that human beings are created in the image of God. That's even greater. Why? Because it includes love your neighbor as yourself, because it's even broader. Why do you love your neighbor? In part because they're an image of God. So my first answer would be that love is an important part of life. So when I speak of Judaism embracing life, I mean to say it is about, or includes in a very substantial way, love. That's my evasive answer to your question. Now I'll give you the more honest or confrontational version of that, which is that I have no reservations at all. In fact, I'm in love with the book, as many other things that Shai has written, because the idea of Judaism, religion of love, I think is correct, it's magnificent, and it's very important to correct the wrong impression. But I have serious reservations about the claim that Judaism is about life. And the truth is, Shai was being polite. Maybe he'll stop, maybe he will express that reservation publicly, because we've discussed it privately too. Particularly, I played it soft in my first words. I say that Judaism is about, and that's what the title, the triumph of life, that Judaism is, in its claim, says, that's the messianic claim, that literally we can overcome all the enemies of life. I mentioned them before, poverty, hunger, those are enemies. They cut life, they underwrite life, they demean life, they dilute it and weaken it. Poverty or discrimination, it degrades the life of somebody else. War certainly kills. That's how war functions. It kills. That's why the prophets dreamed of someday there will be no war, but in the meantime. Anyway, and sickness. Again, so from my point of view, the religion really, now here's when I get to the most serious point. Isaiah, following the logic of what I just described, including overcoming war and overcoming sickness, that's going to be one of his goals. Then he concludes, the logic of this is, Bila hamavet lanetzach. Death will be swallowed up in eternity. In other words, we're going to eventually overcome death itself. And if I would have been stand by my own principles and take the words seriously as I do, I should have. So in following the logic, I concluded, that's right. That's right. I do believe. That's why I said a moment ago that we're supposed to take power to overcome all these enemies. Well, the logic is, if we take enough power, we'll overcome all those enemies. We will, in fact, overcome death. And then when I said that, I got shocked and a little scared. So because Shai said it very nicely too. He said, look, it's death that keeps us and makes us human. You really want to give up the human experience in order to live forever? And so in the book, I got a little nervous, and I said, well, okay, if that sounds like I jumped the shark, I'd like to give you a kind of a more moderate version that maybe you can live with. Same Isaiah in chapter 65 says, life will grow, will be extended, we'll overcome enemies. Not we won't live forever, but we will, we'll extend life, and therefore, nar ben mea shana yom. When someone dies at 100 years old, they'll say, oh, it was just a kid. In other words, I presume, 200, 250 will be the life expectancy.
Can I interrupt you for one moment, Rav Yitz? You just presented two different ideas. You said one of them was a moderate version of the other one that you moderated deliberately. Can I push and ask, in your heart of hearts, which feels more true to you?
That's what I want to say.
Great.
After I decided to moderate it, I had to come to grips with resurrection. The rabbis really believed in the resurrection, meaning the bringing back to life of the dead. And I came to realize what they were saying was, Isaiah was a piker. What do you mean you'll stop future death, will cure all diseases? What we're trying to tell you is, if you want to straighten out this world, you have to revive all the past death people, because they shouldn't have died. It's a great tragedy, and so on. So first of all, I had to come to grips with, take them seriously. They made this the second blessing of the Shemona Esrei, the central prayer. When you stand before God, it's the second blessing. You say it 3 times in a regular day, 4 times on Shabbat, 5 times on Yom Kippur. They really meant it. So I really wrestled with it, and you know what? I came to realize something which I had lived through once before and then a second time. In struggling with the Holocaust, I really couldn't accept and couldn't live with all those deaths and the horror of those deaths, the children burnt alive and so on. And sometime after 5 or 6 or 7 years, I was trying to think of what could be consolation. And again, religious people told me, the afterlife and this, that's no consolation. And I came to realize the only consolation would be give me back those bodies, those living people. And the truth is that when we lost JJ, I went through that same experience. I really couldn't accept it. I mean, I could accept it. I accepted it. I knew I had no choice. But there was no way of filling in. There was no way, the pain or the love or the missing, there's no way of listening. And it occurred to me after a while, that's what the rabbis were trying to say. Not trying to escape humanity and live beyond the limit. What they were trying to say was that the human being, the one that you love, is irreplaceable. And that death is therefore an irreplaceable wound. And you shouldn't accept it. You should rebel. You should fight it. That's what they were talking about. And they also try to say the one that you love is not a soul that you will meet again. And again, I dream about it. I'd like to meet in the afterlife. But that's not the person. The person that you love, had green eyes and a beautiful smile and a quirky personality and this. And that's what I would need, or nothing less than that would restore it. And so I decided, I fudged it, but I decided in the end, I want to take the rabbis seriously. The desire to overcome death is potentially anti-human and potentially destructive, but the commitment of love that you don't want to accept death as the final word, and it should be reversed and fought, that I stand behind, and I think it is in fact one of the great Jewish teachings and one of the great Jewish challenges.
So please note, Rav Yitz was invited to critique me and critiqued himself instead. It's fun to be his student. You get off easy. So Tali, to answer your question first, what do I think about Judaism is about life? So I think one of the most powerful names or descriptors, I'm not sure exactly which it is, we have for God is Melech HaChafetz B'Chaim, a God who delights in life, who desires life. And something I've been thinking about a lot, totally unrelated to this, the last couple of months, is how already in the first chapter of Tanakh, in Breshit Aleph, there is a desire, I think, to evoke for the reader just how deeply God loves life. And I'll give you just 2 quick examples of this, one of which has become very important to me in my own thinking about living in a time of climate crisis. God does not just create plants, we are told. God creates plants liminam, of all kinds. God does not just create birds, God creates birds of all kinds, limineim. God doesn't just create animals, God creates animals of all kinds. Genesis 1 is, I think, quite literally preoccupied with biodiversity. It's not just, God doesn't just, when God made the animals. It's like, look, God made so many of them. And God made birds. Look how many of them. And God made plants. You know how many trees there are? Right? That's Breshit Aleph. It's describing how important it is for God to make life, not just human life, organic life, flourishing organic life. And then, right, at the end of the chapter, in verses that are familiar, of course, from Shabbat Kiddush, Vayar Elohim et kol asher asa v'hinei tov ma'od, and God saw all that God had made, and behold, it was very good. I think it's very clear that in Breshit Aleph, the constant repetition of tov, good, tov me'od, very good, is a statement of delight. My colleague, Rabbi Effie Unterman, introduced me to a passage in Midrash Tehillim, which the rabbis actually say about that verse, Ein vayar ela lishon simcha. The meaning of and God saw is and God took delight in. Right? This is a God who loves life. That's sort of setting the tone for the whole rest of the story. And by the way, that's also the tragedy of what happens, right? God says to the people, I'm quoting only part of this deliberately, Rivu umil'u et haaretz, multiply and fill the earth. But then we hear, just a couple chapters later, Rabba ra'ata adam ba'aretz, Actually, evil was what they made a lot of. Vatimale haaretz chamas. And violence is what they filled it with, right? It's the lifelessness, the assault on life that breaks God's heart. God wants more life, and human beings say no. That's the tragedy. And then, it's a different discussion, God has to, as it were, learn how to mercifully love us anyway. The great project, in many ways, of the opening chapters of Breshit. It's easy to love people you like. It's harder to love people who drive you crazy. Which is why I'm so honored that Tali loves me. And of course, Ramban's notion of wanting others to flourish is actually, I think, just another way of saying wanting them to experience the fullness of life, wanting them to partake of all of God's gifts, of love, of prosperity, of connection, of community, of learning, of intellectual growth, of accomplishment, of creativity, as Rav Soloveitchik taught, right? That's so fundamental. I think it's actually hard not to accept that Judaism is about life. Which leads me to say one thing, perhaps as since Rav Yitz critiqued himself, I'll critique myself as well. The statement, Judaism is, I thought this would be obvious, but it hasn't been obvious to everyone I've taught. The statement, Judaism is about love, is intended as a provocation, not as a comprehensive theology, right? Judaism is about a lot of things. Judaism is about justice. Judaism is about fidelity and faithfulness. Judaism is about a lot of things, right? But it is centrally about love. If I may quote Ethan Tucker for a minute, right? This is the summary of 30 years of a relationship with Ethan Tucker, who approached me after a talk I gave and said, I think this is almost a direct quote, "You know you don't understand your own title." And I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "You think the title is Judaism is about love. Actually, the title is Judaism is about love." And that's exactly right. That's exactly the point I wanted to make, right? That's exactly right. I mean, Judaism is about love. By the way, of course, a woman came up to me recently and I quoted that story and she said, "No, the title is Judaism is about love." And I was like, I love the Jewish people. Like, they never stop nudniking you. They never stop. In other words, I think Judaism is centrally about love, but my point is not that that's like, I'm not interested necessarily. One way in which perhaps there's a difference between the way that I write and the way that you write, Rav Yitz, is I've a little bit grown up in the postmodern suspicion of meta-narratives. And meta-narratives, grand narratives of the whole thing. And Rav Yitz is in many ways the great articulator of a contemporary meta-narrative of Jewish life. This is the big story, with everything that is compelling and powerful and almost breathtaking about that. And it opens itself to the critique, of course, of what are the dangers of meta-narratives? What do they leave out? What do they, right? I think it's a really interesting question. I guess I mean the statement Judaism is about love less as a meta-narrative and more as, I think, a really helpful way of thinking about orienting all of the stuff that Judaism is helpfully oriented by applying to it the lens of love, of growing in love as a response to Hashem's love.
It's a fair point. Yeah, well, I will say it is a meta-narrative. In fact, a number of people along the way said to me, "This is the wrong century. You're in the wrong century." Meta-narratives don't go well. But I want to say
I did not say that.
The implication I want to. But if you take that seriously, my answer is it's not just an intellectual creation. It becomes a challenge, and it becomes the driving force that all of us are supposed to take on. In other words, I'm trying to say, if you believe that Judaism is the triumph of life, that means you have to work for it, and it's not so easy. Or even more, right. To me, one of my favorite passages in the whole book is that God loves life. Start with that. Every time you see in the Torah, when the life shows up in the first chapter, what does God say? Two things. Blessing, a gesundheit dein Keppel, loves life, and number two, pru, God wants more. So, and Isaiah says, what's his interpretation of the whole story? So thus saith God, the creator of the earth and of the heavens, this is not meant to be empty, it's meant to be full of life. And so, I was at SAR school yesterday. At 3 o'clock was a dismissal, and the whole place, hundreds of kids running around, chaos, screaming. The principal said to me, look at that. I said, this is God's vision of paradise. It's a building, and there are hundreds of little kids running around and making noise. That's what God means. He wants my world filled with life. But that also means, and this I say to my favorite pastor, it means that we're supposed to live on the side of life. What does that mean? It means that every action you take in your life, stop and weigh it, and make sure that it's on the side of life, and not on the side of death. Or you make it even sharper, because Maimonides says, literally, if you look at the Torah, Moses says this: life and good are placed in Moses' eyes against death and evil. Of course, Moses chooses life, but Maimonides says, you know what that means? Death and good are identical. Life and good are identical, and death and evil are identical. And every act of life should be a choice of life. Every good deed is defined if you chose life, and every bad deed involves some choice of death, even if you don't see it. Maybe not killing somebody. How about degrading somebody? Every choice of taking advantage and destroying something. So it means literally each of us, and that's my, if you will, that's why I say take the merit of servanthood. It's supposed to stop and not simply do everything. When you eat, when you name it, when you transport, when you drive. I try to tell somebody what the Torah is trying to say is that electric vehicles are more kosher than fossil fuels because they cause less pollution. In other words, that you have to literally stop and measure. It's every act of life. How do you maximize the life and minimize the death in it? It's a major challenge, but it's also an incredible opportunity. And so I decided, if you don't challenge people to the limit, will they try hard enough to do what I think the Torah dreams is, that your whole life could be one vast affirmation of life. And if you embrace life, if you live life deeply, you are closer to God than if you simply live on the surface and on the shallow.
It's interesting because something that I think has become very important to me in my own thinking is, when I first started studying Christianity in a serious way many years ago now, I started reading Martin Luther, which was very complicated because, as we know, Luther was, among other things, a great theologian and a vitriolic anti-Semite. I mean, in ways that are like hair-raising. But one of the things that Luther, and in his wake Lutherans, talk about is the idea that we are given the commandments in order that we learn that we are unable to obey them. We break ourselves upon the law. And I think what is so sort of gorgeous about rabbinic tradition is that it's not Pollyannish. I would say it's not even optimistic. The language I use in the book is that rabbinic tradition is possibilistic, right? But the laws are there, the commandments are there, I think, to invite us to consider whether we are capable of actually being and doing more than we think we are. It's in that sense really the antithesis of the sort of, right, a traditional Lutheran would say, Ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, love your neighbor, is there so that you realize all I can do is throw myself on God's mercy. I can't love my neighbor. And it's almost like I can hear Chazal, the sages, saying, you sure? Not even for a minute here and a minute there? Really, not even when this person is hurting and vulnerable, all you can think about is yourself? Really? Is that so? Are you sure? There's something there that I find so extraordinarily moving, this sort of Judaism as a goad to become more than we think we're capable of being. And I hear, Rav Yitz, when you talk about sort of weighing every moment, whether I'm on the side of life, that feels to me like a very rabbinic understanding of the commandment of uvacharta v'chayim, right? Choose life. Like, you don't have to just do what you always do. There's the possibility of turning. There's the possibility of being more, doing more, responding more deeply.
And by the way, and it's a beautiful point, also, I love the fact that tradition has this visionary perfect dream, but it says one step at a time. And the truth is it compromises, and many of the commandments are not the best possible. They're the best possible right now. They're not the ideal. And that's part of respect for human life. And when you look back now, I mention this dream of making the world perfect. That was the driving dream of the most horrifying totalitarian, destructive movements of the last 200 years, which started to make the world perfect and started to improve human beings, right? Mao Zedong wanted to make women no longer the dolls. They bound their feet when they were little babies, so they grew up, they couldn't walk, but they were dolls. He wanted to say they were equal. But in order to make them equal, there were people who were slow or people who were opposed, so he decided, we'll kill them all. So he killed 40 million people in order to give women dignity. And then that still didn't accomplish the goal. So he said, the family is a source of selfishness. So break up the family, separate people. They shouldn't be able to live together as a family. In other words, if you don't accept human limitations, if you don't accept human faults as part of your love and as part of your working with them and as part of your belief that they can do better, but start with accepting them, not in the Lutheran sense of original sin, that you're hopelessly evil and maybe Christ, if you throw yourself on God's mercy, Christ will liberate you, but rather the other way. Try your best. You indeed may fail, but A, I love you and God will accept you even with your failures, and B, you can then do better the next time, and then you can do tshuva and stop the sin. And to me, that's part of the dynamic of the tradition that I really particularly love, the combination of a visionary ideal and a realistic, humane, kind, loving willingness to work with people as they are.
Thank you. Whether Judaism is about life or is about love, this is still a Jewish crowd, which means I know everyone is itching to get a word in. Someone will be coming around with index cards and pens. I'll ask you to signal if you would like an index card and a pen. We'll collect and take audience questions from those. Before that, though, I'd love to ask, Rav Yitz, you spoke very movingly about particular points in your life where you struggled with what I'll call religious heartbreak. And what I'd really like to ask, if I can, each of you, is you describe God confidently and beautifully in each of your books. I'd like to know if the God you reach for in times of crisis is the God you describe in your book.
You know, let me, if I could, start. I was very taken, Tali, with your formulation about, your work beginning in heartbreak. And 7 months of traveling around the country, talking with people about Judaism and love and about my book has taught me things about my own relationship to this work that I didn't know while I was doing it. And one of them, I just want to sort of share this experience because I think it's actually very, very important, actually, for a kind of self-awareness about the work we do. I had experiences as a kid of a Judaism that would crush anyone that got in its way. When I was, many of you know this, when I was 12 years old, my father very abruptly died one day, and I was left alone with a mother who was not really able to raise me. And I remember thinking, just bear with me here for a minute, because I think this really is important. I remember thinking, this is terrible what we do to boys. I remember thinking, as a 12-year-old, having just lost my father, I am going to conduct myself so that people will say it's like nothing happened. Right? That's what we do or what we did, I assume we still do in many ways to boys. And for 8 months, I went to yeshiva day school every day and said not a word, not to my classmates, not to my teachers, no one. And then one day, in the spring of 8th grade, I'm sitting in our halacha yomis shir, our daily class in Jewish law, 15 minutes, and we're learning hilchot brachot, the laws of blessings, and our teacher gets to Baruch Dayan ha'emet. Blessed is the true judge, the bracha said about tragedies, and my armor cracks, finally. I raise my hand and I say, what happens when a tragedy is so great that you just can't say that bracha? Now think for a minute about what you would say were you that 8th grade teacher, right? What my teacher said was, and this is a direct quote as I can hear it now, for a true mamin, that is not a question, right? For a true believer, that is not a question. And I remember the experience like it was yesterday of wanting to be a floor tile, right? The humiliation, the shame, the sense of being squashed, right? And later that day, I had the thought, I mean, it's amazing, all these years later, it's like the whole day is vivid to me. I had the thought, if this is what Torah is, I'm out. I don't want any part of any of this. Why do I share this? Because, when we built, I don't know if you remember this, Ellie, one of the first meetings we ever had as the founding faculty of Yeshivat Hadar, which is a grandiose way of saying 5 moderately underemployed rabbis. We're sitting in a room around a table, and I said, thinking about that moment, although I don't think I made it explicit, we have to make a deal. We have to build a Beit Midrash where no human experience and no report of human pain is ever driven out of the room because of our religious needs. We can't ever do that to anyone. And I look back now on that teacher of mine, by the way, he was saying Kaddish for his father that year. My question clearly, I don't know what it did exactly. I'm not defending him, merely trying to understand compassionately what happened. And I share this because I think when you articulate a vision of Torah, you are usually both responding to a vision that you either experienced or were taught that was problematic, and or trying to amplify an experience or a vision that was modeled for you. And I will say that in those years when I was in high school, totally alone in every way, for reasons I can't explain to this day, I would regularly meet people, not regularly, but I met quite a few people who would say to me things like, oh, anytime we're ever having a Shabbos meal, you're invited. In fact, I'll share here, because some of you knew Walter Dubler, who just passed away a few weeks ago. The second time I was ever in Walter and Nancy Dubler's apartment, I was a senior in high school. The second time I was ever there, I'd never met them before. I never had a meaningful conversation with them. I don't know what Walter saw. Walter reaches into his pocket. It's hard for me to talk about this without sobbing, so bear with me. He reaches into his pocket. He takes out the keys to his apartment. He hands them to me and he says, these are yours. You never have to ask again. And I experienced in that moment, I didn't have that language. Oh, v'halachta b'drachav. You should walk in God's ways. Mahu nichem avelim afata. Right, just as God comforts the mourner, so should you. Those two moments of the teacher who says, you shut up, young man, and the person who says, my home is literally yours, those are the poles of the choice we have all the time in what do we want Torah to be, right? We make that choice again and again and again, and without sounding grandiose, I'd like to believe God is on one of those sides. Just very briefly, to actually answer your question, there are times when I'm in crisis when the idea of a God who loves me but does not intervene to fix things is very helpful. And there are times when it is remarkably hollow. But I would say, I find myself wondering sometimes, I wish I wasn't like this, but I can't help myself in certain ways. I find myself saying, Shira Malot Mimamakim, and I find myself saying, what are you so moved by? You don't even really believe, what are you doing, right? It's the curse of you can't shut up the little inner philosophy guy, right? But there is something that I find unbelievably moving about this, which is that I often think to myself, in 14th century Prague, someone was crying over their mother being in the hospital and they screamed these very verses to God. And covenant, as Rav Yitz and so many others teach, is about being connected to generations past and generations future. I love the fact that when I'm clinging for dear life, I'm clinging for dear life in the same way that generations of my ancestors clung to it, and I pray generations of my grand descendants will as well. We might mean different things by the words, we might mean them more or less literally at different moments of our lives, but there is something about standing in continuity that is essential to what covenant is. I think you actually say that better than I do, right? There's something about the sheer power of that. That's about God for me, because it is about who we connect to, but it's not about a developed theology. It's about the raw desire to connect to God from the abyss, in the abyss. And the intuition, at least some of the time, that God is actually found there. Some of the time.
So again, one of the implications of what you just heard from Shai is that religion is not or at least a proper or a fulfilling religion is not about following a set of laws or even commandments. It's really a set of relationships and of attitudes to life that are expressed in living in an actual behavior pattern. And I mean it in this sense. I've had my people over the course of several thousand years have had many and deeper experiences where you really felt you're not alone. God was holding you, God was holding your hand, God was with you. You were not lost. Or again, I said it this morning in prayer, I've had such moments where he says, if I really felt the point I was about to collapse or quit, Chastacha Hashem, but somehow I felt your loving kindness and it gave me a little strength to stand up. So I've had such moments and such experiences, not all the time obviously, but it's a genuine relationship is the point. In the genuine relationship you have moments of expectation, you have moments of failure, you have moments of anger and moments of rejection. As I said, my religious crisis was encountering the Holocaust. And the truth is, as Shai said, there was a period when I'm beginning to say that God has chosen not to intervene because humans are supposed to intervene. When I said, how about forgetting that? Let's go back to the bad old days when I was a kid and as a parent, I was crossing the street and the car was coming. You wouldn't say, I stand there and I'm with you, but I'm not going to stop I wanted that, and the truth is there was a period of great, not just the depression and questioning, and some of those passages when I would read or think some of those passages, in that moment you can't feel there's a God in the world. It's impossible. I said they're dumping kids into a burning pit alive, and to save a half a penny's worth of gas, by the way. When you feel that, you can't feel the other. So I had a crisis of faith, no question. What the crisis was that I had days, and frankly, living in Israel, Jerusalem at the time, and with my wife and my child, when life was so strong, when God was so present, when the redemption was before my eyes, when Jerusalem was the sound of joy and the sound of gloom, which Jeremiah predicted 2,000 years ago or 3,000 years ago when it was a rotten, destroyed. It was so real, I couldn't deny that either. I wouldn't want to deny that. But again, if it's an honest relationship, if it's love, then there were days when it was miserable, and I was very angry. And in fact, one of the turning points of my life, I still remember, when it dawned upon me, because I kept saying, where was God? Where was God? And then, of course, it dawned upon me, and particularly some of the classic texts, the answer is God. God is where, with people, with us, when we're in trouble. And I still remember sort of that whole experience, sort of realizing that means that God was in the ghettos, being tortured and hungered and humiliated and insulted and hurt. And in the gas chambers, asphyxiating, choking, losing control of your sphincters involuntarily as your brain is collapsing. And it was kind of interesting and almost amazing about me. I sort of, for a moment, felt God's pain, almost compassion. I sort of felt, I should be a little more forgiving too. I shouldn't be so angry. I mean, the Talmud does say that when human beings suffer, even the wicked suffer, God has a splitting headache. That's literally the language of the Torah. A splitting headache, meaning that we have to understand this. So again, I think faith, the true faith, is honest. The faith that tried to tell you not to toil upon others is the faith that said the Holocaust was a punishment for our sins, just like in Babylon. I could never accept that. That was where I began to change my whole religious way of life and thinking, because I couldn't accept that notion, even though it was there in the Torah. I couldn't. What sin could justify, torturing people and killing them en masse and so on? So what I'm trying to just get at is, in the end, I think faith is truthful. It's a relationship based on honesty and genuine feelings. So yes, there are, and the tradition offers us history and record of past moments when God was with us and we felt totally helped and totally supported and totally with it, sometimes in victory and sometimes in defeat. And we should draw upon those experiences, and then in our own life we'll have those experiences, we add those experiences, and at the same time, we have these other experiences. I'm trying to get people to break out of the model, which is the first stage, where really, if I do the wrong thing, God will punish me. And if I have cancer, what did I do? What was my sin? On the one hand, get that out of your mind, because that's not the way God relates. And on the other hand, when you have cancer, or when you lost someone you love, it does hurt, and you can say that, and you can even say, at this moment, it's very hard to believe. So, at one point, in extreme fashion, I sort of said, the covenant is broken. I withdraw that. My position is it wasn't broken. It was transmitted to a new level. But after saying it was broken, I said, but it still operates. And so I quote Rav Nachman, the famous line, that no heart is so whole as a broken heart. Well, I want to suggest in our lifetime, no faith is so whole as a broken faith. A faith that's willing to admit failure, willing to admit defeat, willing to meet moments of disillusionment, but at the same time, it's whole because it does feel this incredible other reality, a God who sustains the world, in which life grows with such luxurious and rich nurture, and is there to tell me, never mind that the whole world and the Constitution says that you're black skinned, so you're inferior. Never you mind. God, I tell you, is telling you that you're an image of God and you're equal to everybody else here. And you live with that. And I think the blessing, so it's not full time, but you know what? The moments that they're infinitely valuable too. Someone once said to me about JJ, I said, we had not enough years, but those years was like infinity. Every moment, you've all had that experience, every moment of joy and love and connection to your wife, to your husband, to your child, to your friend. It's like it's infinite, even if it only lasts for 5 minutes or 10 minutes or days or years. And that's, I think, if you live with that, you will have a much richer, and that's what the tradition is trying to say. You'll have a much richer life if you'll embrace all of it and be willing to go with it.
Thank you. I'm going to ask, I think we have time for one question from the audience. They're great questions, by the way. And Rav Yitz, you talked at the beginning about what I did about basically asking for your Torah on 1 foot. Get ready for this one. Authors can't control what is happening in the world when their books come out. Your books both came out in a particularly challenging, difficult, painful year. The question from the audience is about what particular lessons from your Torah you would like to hold up in a post-October 7th world. I'm going to ask each of you for 2 minutes on that question.
This is a very sore point. My book went to the final editor on October 15th. So I called them and said, look, you can't publish a book with a major chapter on Israel and ignore what just happened. It's impossible. They said, sorry, this is a big press. It's not you're one of God knows how many books are, and you're in line, and we can't do it. Well, after going crazy and arguing a long time, they finally agreed if I would cut 1,000 words and write 1,000 words so it would fit into the same whatever molds, they let me do that much. So it's still raw and so point, and truth is I do hope to write further chapters on this matter. So I want to rewrite. Having said that, you're asking what, I think the honest truth is that I sort of went through this experience in wrestling with the Holocaust for many years, so it didn't change my basic conception of the book and of the orientation of the religion. The religion says two things. One it says is that love is as strong as death. Asa Kamovet Ava, the Song of Songs says that love is as fierce and as powerful as death. And it expresses itself, the love continues after death, but no less it expresses itself in that love responds to death by creating life. So my answer is I won't back away. I think that is still a message in the book that I believe in. That you have to take power to protect life, and that's what we're doing as Jews, and Israel's trying to do, take power to protect life and to stop the killers. And we, American Jews, and I'm happy to say that most Jews, and in fact, even Jews who in some powers were further distant, understand you respond, you take power to protect life and to make sure that evil and death don't win. Secondly, you increase life. And you increase life, and that includes, by all means, seeking peace more, and by all means, seeking to help the refugees and Palestinians and everybody else as best you can. And that would be the main message here, is that you have to embrace life even in the worst moments, even when there are serious setbacks, and you have to have trust in yourself and in life and in everybody else's life that they will not quit and they will not give in either, but that they will try harder, and we can help each other. And as a community, we can maybe raise by each other's models. But I think that basic message remains. And now it's a little hard to believe, but I think if we hang in there and we work through this period, we'll again to days when this belief is much easier and much clearer.
So I had the opposite experience, which is that I got a call from my editor on October 11th, and he said the following thing. It was kind of an amazing conversation. He said, I just want you to understand how publishing works. When a book has gone to press, nothing, and I do mean nothing is changeable. That said, do I need to hold the book? It's a very touching moment, actually, and what I said to him was, I have no idea, give me 24 hours. And I called him back the next day and I said, here's the thing. I can barely breathe right now. Anything that I say, I'm going to regret in 3 weeks, let alone the thought that my grandchildren will read it in 25 years. And I want to say something else about why that is. Never, ever, under any circumstance, will I allow anti-Semites to define or control my reading of Torah. My reading of Torah is my understanding of Torah, and Hamas can do what Hamas can do. This is our Torah. It doesn't belong to them. Now, I will just say quickly that a chapter in my book that I thought was a throwaway, really, has ended up being very important to me, just thinking about the last year, which is, very quickly, I talk about the anomaly in the Mishnah, where the Mishnah describes Tisha B'Av as the day when everything inconceivably horrible happened, and then 2 Mishnayot later describes the 15th of Av, Tu B'Av, as a festival of love, right? Now, as I point out, this is the rabbis seemingly being insane. You're sitting Shiva over the destruction of the world, and a lady walks in and says, I know, let's have a mixer. Right? It's like, what is happening? That Mishnah always drove me crazy. Like, what is happening in that Mishnah? It's so crazy, right? Tisha B'Av is, like, if you believe the prophets that the temple was still burning on the 10th of Av, Shiva's not even over yet, and you're having a singles party, right? And it occurred to me a few years ago, oh, you know what? Chazal, as always, in their incredibly understated way, are actually expressing the incredible genius of realizing that trauma makes us go like this. Trauma shuts us down. And they say, you know what we'll do in response to trauma? More love. Now, I don't mean that in some naive way. I don't think love is the only response to being assaulted by your enemies. That would be ridiculous, right? There is rebuilding and protecting and lots of other things. But also, they don't get to kill your love of life. And they don't get to kill your commitment to love because you are an Eved Hashem and not a slave to Hamas's evil. And that, to me, is just like a very powerful lesson. How, in the moments when I want to give up on life, do I hear the rabbi saying, really? The festival of love is coming. It's a very powerful challenge, I think. It's a source for me of great comfort and also of really deep challenge.
Thank you so much. Rav Eli Comfer will close up in one moment, but I just want to take this opportunity to say on behalf of everyone in this room tonight that your books are gifts to the Jewish people, and what you did tonight was a gift to everyone in this room. And we're so grateful.
Can you buy these gifts of these books? Yes, you can. We don't even make any money on it, but I just really want you to read them. On the way out, you can purchase books. And I just want to say it's such a joy to be together. My takeaway from this evening, which was an extraordinary experience, I teared up multiple times, is not everything can be experienced on Zoom. So I really, really appreciate it. Didn't rain for like 3 months, and it rained tonight, and you all came out anyways. And there are many, many other times in which I want you to come out again to Hadar in person. Joey Weisenberg and his band is going to be performing here on December 19th. I think it's actually going to be at B'nai Jeshurun, but in the neighborhood. And Rabbi Aviva Richman is going to be speaking on artificial intelligence for our annual Sharfman lecture on January 7th. We have Minyan throughout the week, and you can always walk into this space to just come in and learn. We moved closer to you. That's how much we want you to be in here. So we are here. We want you to come back here. Thank you so much to our panelists, and we'll see you next time.